Hello, everybody, and happy Thursday. Today, we're going to be talking about getting your image looking good on camera with respect to exposure, white balance, and lots of other fun stuff. And to help me, I have a special guest. Brian Matesh is a photo educator who's based in Palm Beach, Florida, and he's got over 15 years experience helping people improve photography with their skills, and he's the creator of Lightroom Everywhere, which is an in-depth video course, email newsletter, and YouTube live stream for Adobe Lightroom users. So without further ado, let's get Brian on in the case here. Hello, Brian. Welcome to the show. It's so nice of you to join me and help me along with this interesting topic today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on, Neil. This is a near and dear topic. And it's always fun taking the concepts that I use for still photography and kind of apply it to video, but like even more specifically to like live streaming. So
yes, interesting. And for people who actually don't know much about you, even though you're very famous in the photography world, would you like to just let people know a little bit more about yourself and what you do?
Sure. So I'm primarily a photo educator. My kind of pedigree is in still photography, specifically like landscape and travel and wildlife. And as you mentioned, I primarily serve Lightroom users. So if you go, for example, to my YouTube channel or my website, it's content helping Lightroom users manage and edit and share their photos more effectively. But obviously a component of that, a big component of that is video. And so it's just always fun to, like I said, to kind of combine the two. And so if you are a Lightroom user or you're interested in learning Lightroom, improving your Lightroom skills, maybe you're, using like Apple Photos or Google Photos and you kind of want to improve, or you're a Lightroom Classic user and you want to kind of move to this new version of Lightroom, I'd love for you to check out my site.
Great. And Brian, you can be found anywhere, I think, at Brian Matesh, right? Even on
That's correct.
On the tubes and everywhere. So go and check out Brian's site. I've had a look at it. I mean, there's lots of great course material on there. And your YouTube channel's been quite established for many years, right? You've got over, I think it's nearly 30,000 subscribers now, I think. Something like that. Very close anyway, 29 point something. So it's getting pretty close to it, which is great. Well, I appreciate you helping me today. So what we're going to be talking about today is, well, something dear to my heart is getting things looking decent on camera from a video perspective. And if I switch over to the keynote, we're going to be looking at camera basics, and in particular, something mysterious called the exposure triangle, which isn't that mysterious at all, but we're going to hopefully explain a little bit about what that is and some of the components that make up the exposure triangle and some of the gotchas that you may find when setting up your camera. So there's quite a few things to get through. So what we're going to be covering today is, well, what the heck is the exposure triangle? Talking a little bit about white balance and how to set up white balance in your environment, which is pretty straightforward, but can catch a few people out, specifically if they're using auto white balance. And we'll talk about why that isn't always the best thing. Frame rates and avoiding flicker. What frame rate should you really be setting for your videos, specifically around live stream? There's some contention around that. Lots of people like to set it for one particular high frame rate. I don't know why, but we'll get on my soapbox later about that. Color temperature, how to get your camera looking decent with respect to your lighting and your environment. And obviously aperture, ISO, and shutter. Is it ISO or ISO? Because it's the International Standards Organization. But that's another bone of contention, right? What would you say that is? Is it ISO or ISO?
It's the same thing as GIF and GIF.
Yeah.
And it is GIF for that's a hard G.
It's a hard G. There you go.
Yeah, the G is for graphics. But I pronounce it ISO. I know plenty of people who refer to it as ISO. But like you said, it's an acronym. And so I generally will call it ISO and say like ISO 400, ISO 100, not ISO 100.
It's easier to say, right? Yeah. Back
in
the
old
days. Yeah, it's much easier. ISO then. Yeah. All right. And then other considerations for your environment, whether it be studio, lenses, things like that. There's a lot to get through. I'm sure we're going to get through it in about 4 to 5 hours. So we'll see how we go with this live stream. Could be the longest live stream I've done yet, but let's see how we get on. So let's start with the exposure triangle, and we're going to go and show you a little bit more about the components that make this up. But effectively, the exposure triangle is all about three main settings in your camera that you can adjust to get the correct exposure, and each of them will have an effect on the other. And what I mean by that is if you adjust the ISO, then that's obviously going to have an effect on your exposure, which you will probably have to compensate for by changing your shutter speed or your aperture. And we'll show all those interrelationships shortly as we go through each one. So we'll explain each topic, hopefully simply, to explain a little bit about what each of these components are, and then we'll go on and show you sort of with a demo, hopefully with my camera if it's still awake and not fallen asleep, and how that all works. So what is exposure? So for those of you who don't know what overexpose and underexpose look like, I've got a couple of examples here of images that I've taken. Of course, my cats always take precedence when it comes to showing anything. So the first image is an underexposed image. And Brian, what would you say is wrong with this image from a sort of exposure perspective?
Sure. So in an underexposed image, what's happening is you are losing information in the darkest parts of the photo, and that can happen for numerous reasons, primarily to what you said with the exposure triangle, where depending on your settings, yeah, you can see in that photo it's too dark. So generally that is underexposed, and that would indicate that you need to adjust your exposure settings to make it a little bit brighter.
Thank you for that. And on the reverse of that, here's an image that is overexposed. And you can see I've done really well with this particular image. So what would you say is wrong with this, Brian, specifically?
It's like the opposite, where it's the same thing. You have an issue with your exposure settings, but here what's happening is you are allowing in a lot of light. So underexposed, you're not letting enough light in. With overexposed, you're letting too much light in, and so you are losing details in the shadows and the midtones of your image, and that will result in what you have here, which is called blown out highlights. So to underexposed, you're clipping your shadows. You are losing detail in the darkest parts. The overexposed, you're blowing out highlights. You are losing detail in the brightest parts.
And the overexposed and blown out images, particularly from a video perspective, as when I was starting, you know, I've done things wrong and overexposed my image. It's incredibly difficult to recover detail in an overexposed image. I mean, to a similar extent, even underexposed is hard to recover that detail because you're having to adjust your sliders in your editing software to either raise or lower the respective shadows or whatever it might be, and trying to recover highlights, especially in older cameras when they're not as good as what we have today with 8-bit video and things like that. It is really, you know, you're losing a lot of the detail and so on. So it's very hard to recover that. So what we're looking for today is to get you to a point where you can actually expose your image correctly. Now, these are just iPhone images that I've shown, but at least the middle one shows that this image is relatively exposed correctly with my poor photography skills, but at least you can see the difference between under, over, and correctly exposed. So hopefully that explains what we're trying to get to today. And not only exposure, we're obviously going to be talking about color, some composition things, and just to get your image looking super crispy and fun. So let's move on to our first topic within the exposure triangle, which is our aperture or depth of field or depth of focus. And it's respectively known as or measured in f-stops. And this really is, think of this as the iris of your camera. It's the amount of light that is being let into your camera from the lens's perspective. And the lower the number, the more light is going to be let in your camera. And I have to say, that took me a while to get my head around that. The lower the number, the more light. And it's difficult when you're trying to explain this to somebody. I've tried to explain this to people before just by talking to them, but it's much easier with a diagram, as you can see here. So a lower f-stop, f1.4 in this case on the left, has got a very wide aperture. So imagine you're going outside and you are basically opening up your aperture to let as much light in as possible. So the lower the number in this case, and some lenses go to 0.99. I have seen some ridiculously expensive lenses that go to that low of aperture, but an f1.4 is going to get as much light in to your camera as possible. And the result of that is that you're going to get a very, very shallow depth of field or focus plane. And what that means is the images that are the closest to the camera are going to be in focus, but that you've got a very narrow band of focus with regards to what you see. So basically, you're going to get a very blurry background, a very shallow depth of field. It's almost hard when you're trying to manually focus with an aperture this large, because the slightest movement on your focus ring is going to throw the focus out very quickly, because you've got a very narrow field of focus. So obviously f1.4 lets in more light, gives you a blurry background, shallow depth of field, and we'll talk about some of the ways that can be faked later with iPhones and things. On the opposite side, f22. Imagine when you're going outside into a very bright light and your iris starts to close up. So what you're doing there is letting in as least amount of light as possible, which is great for very, very bright conditions, and also great if you want to keep everything in focus. So you've got a very, what's the word? Is it wide focus plane, or a
deep,
not a shallow, a deep focus plane? That means everything is going to be in focus effectively, and you're not going to get any shallow depth of field. You're not going to get any blurry background. But I guess it's great for, in some cases, landscape photography, which is what you specialize in, right? You want to get most of the landscape in focus to an extent. I know there's different techniques for doing that, but an f22 is going to let less light. You're going to get more things in focus. And then obviously in the middle, we've got a happy medium f5.8. So you're going to get some shallow depth of field, going to be letting in not as much light as f1.4, but obviously not constraining the light as much as f22. Is there anything else you want to add to that? Because hopefully I've tried to articulate that best I can.
No, you did wonderfully. Yeah, so there are a few things. First, you have to kind of, when we're talking about aperture and your depth of field through the lens of live streaming, I know a lot of people like to have that really nice separation between, so they're really sharp and that everything behind them falls out of focus. And my only kind of caveat to that, and we might talk about, I can't remember if you've got this on your slide deck, Neil, but that's great if you have a fast lens. And that's how, when you talk about lenses, if you hear someone say, oh, I've got a really fast lens, that means that the lens is capable of opening to like f1.4 or f1.2 or even f2.8. But in terms of live streaming, you want to make sure that you have autofocus set, and that the camera knows where you are in the frame. Reason for that, because Neil touched on this. If you have your camera set to manual focus and you're at f1.4, if you were to take an object, and put it close to the camera would not refocus. Or if you kind of fidget or move around, your plane of focus at f1.4 could be so thin that if you kind of lean forward towards the camera, you'll be out of focus if you're in manual focus. So that's why, by all means, have that really pleasing shallow depth of field, but remember to keep your autofocus engaged on your camera.
Yes, that's a really good point. I used to use Panasonic cameras back in the day, the old GH5, and I had a 16mm Sigma lens. I think it was an f1.4. Loved it because it gave me shallow depth of field similar to what you're seeing now. But I would have to be like this. I could not move because it was manual focus. The autofocus isn't good, or wasn't good back then with the Panasonic cameras. They're a lot better now, of course, but back then they weren't. So having to sit very rigid. And I remember trying to set up manual focus on your own. That's tough. You have to put something here, and then you go behind the camera and tweak it a little bit, and then you just, the slightest tweak, and boom, it's out of focus.
Done.
But anyway, yeah, that's a good point. So autofocus is your friend, and obviously we'll touch on that a little bit later. But so that is f-stop. So that's one way of controlling your exposure. Obviously, letting in tons of light and just doing that and without changing any of the other settings on your camera is going to lead to maybe a blown out or overexposed image. So what else can control that? Well, we'll show you. Actually, I have this set up already on the camera. So for those of you who are Sony users, this is the older Sony menu system, but I know a lot of people use the Sony EV10 or ZVE10. There's so many different varieties of Sony cameras. You can effectively change the settings if you're in manual mode on your Sony camera to affect the aperture. So I'm just going to go to the ZV1. Here we have a Ecamm, no, not sponsored, Ecamm mug here. And you'll see on the menu system that if I just change the arrow down here, I'm going to change the aperture right now. So at the moment, you can see that my speaker at the end here is in sort of quite shallow depth of field. It's a little bit out of focus. It's blurry. That's what we want. So if I change this now, and I've actually got auto ISO on at the moment, just so I don't have to fiddle around with too many things. And if I start to wind this up, you can see that the background is becoming more in focus as I start to wind up the f-stop. So you're getting to the point now, and I'm getting to the end of my ISO limit, which is 6400 on this camera. So at f8.0, you can see that the mug or Ecamm mug is in focus. My keyboard down here, the roadcaster at the end, and the speaker is pretty much in focus. I can't see on this small screen, but take my word for it, it's getting close to being in focus compared to if I now wind this back down to f1.8, you can see that slowly the speaker is becoming out of focus and you're getting a more shallow depth of field. So as a demo, that's pretty much what your aperture will do. And I will just say hello to George, primarily to make sure that my comments are coming in as expected. Hello, George. Yep. Well, they sort of worked, but they should be down here. And you should be smaller. 1 second, George. Let me just shrink you up a little bit. One of these days.
Looks like George has one of those mugs too.
He does. George, we all have one of those mugs. There you go. Hey, nice to see you, George. Thanks for joining. Hopefully this is going to be of interest to you. So let's go back to the keynote. So that's how you said. Yeah, go ahead.
Neil, could you go back to the live view for a second? There's a point I also want to make here, and to help conceptualize your depth of field or your plane of focus, because you could also put your focus reticle on the speaker in the back, right? And what will happen is the camera will focus on that speaker, but that plane of focus will be kind of limited to the speaker, and then everything in front of you. So the mug would actually go out of focus. So yeah, think about aperture controlling kind of how deep your focus is. So even here, like when you look at my two hands, I'm trying to align it, you have a foreground and a background, and you can actually see how this this hand is in focus, but I'm out of focus because the aperture on my camera is set to also 1.8 or maybe 2.0. And the camera's choosing to focus on the thing that's closest to it, because my focus box is right here in the center. And so if I were to move it, then the camera refocuses, and now my plane of focus covers me. So that's how you kind of can think about aperture related to plane of focus. It's not necessarily fixed where it unless you lock your focus, which we said not to do. But again, if you put your hand up, you're basically changing your plane of focus to be closer to the camera. So anyway, that's good.
A really good
I don't want to. Yeah,
that's a good point. I can't, unfortunately, if I go to the live view, I can't move my focus plane because it's the touch screen is not active at the moment because it's HDMI output. But if I'm going to move the camera.
Oh, there you go. Yeah, exactly.
So if I move the camera, now you can see.
There you go.
As Brian just pointed out very eloquently, that moving the focus point is now shifting the plane of focus. Now the speaker is in focus in the back, and right here you can see that this is out of focus. If I put my hand in there, my hand is going to be focused because I've got that really annoying product showcase on there. But I'm just going to put it back to here for now. And there's different focus modes as well. That's probably another video in itself. Wide, narrow, focus point. But anyway, yes, we could get ahead of ourselves there. It could be a long stream. Sit back, get a coffee. It's showtime. We could be here for a while.
There we go.
All right. So ISO sensitivity to light. So imagine this as a gain control on your camera. You can compensate for being in low light conditions by changing the ISO value. And every camera is different. Now, some Sony cameras look up to, is it 12,800, some 128,000, something ridiculous, right?
Yes.
Some of the newer Sony cameras.
25,600.
25,600. So you can obviously compensate for dark conditions by whacking up or changing the ISO, but there are some trade-offs. Higher ISOs introduce noise into the image. Now, it's not it's introducing noise. The noise is already there in the sensor. What you're doing is changing the gain on the sensor. Think of it as a volume control of turning up and down the sensitivity of that sensor to the light hitting it. So the more you turn it up, the more sensitive it's going to be to light. But the result of that, unfortunately, is that you're going to get a grainy, noisy image. So that's effectively why you should, in theory, keep your ISO as low as possible. Brian had a very good point, though. There are circumstances where you potentially want to have a higher ISO in a condition where you've got a higher shutter speed. And maybe you could just talk a little bit about that before we go on to shutter speed as well.
Sure. It all depends on what the intent is for either the video clip or the photo that you're going to take. But in the event that, for whatever reason, you need to have a longer shutter, a longer duration, or a shorter duration. So let's start with a longer duration. Let's say you need a 1 second exposure for whatever reason. And at your current ISO, let's say you have a higher ISO set, which makes your sensor the camera sensor more sensitive to light. What will happen is if you have a long exposure, 1 second, plus a high ISO like 6,000, odds are you will overexpose your photo, which Neil showed earlier what that looks like. That means everything is just going to be overly bright. You're going to lose information in the midtones and the shadows. So if you still need that 1 second exposure, what you can do is you can reduce the ISO, so bring it down to like 100, which is generally one of the lower native ISO settings. What that'll do is that will make the sensor less sensitive, and it'll more or less kind of even out your exposure. The reverse is if you need to have a fast exposure, like 1/1000th of a second, but there's not enough light, it's just dark. Well, in those situations, you can increase your ISO, make the sensor more sensitive, and it will exactly like Neil said, it adds gain to the sensor, which will make things, I guess, brighter. I don't want to say brighter because it's not. The brightness is static based on the light in your scene, but it'll allow you to capture the light quicker at the expense of that noise the signal noise that Neil referenced.
Exactly. Thank you so much for explaining that. So yeah, there is going to be more noise in your image if you turn up your ISO. Now in video terms, again, it just depends on the environment that you're working in, the type of lens that we just spoke about that you have, how sensitive that lens is to letting in light as well. So as we mentioned, a lower aperture value will give you more light into your camera, so therefore you can reduce the ISO. But I'll just show you here, obviously the ISO value is this figure here at the bottom where it says ISO. And if I go onto the camera here, I'm going to change this at the moment because the ISO is set to automatic. So I'm going to actually just change it. And you can see what will happen. So I'll just change it now. We're at 125. And if I start to change the ISO value, you can see obviously 160, it's dark, and I'm going to start turning it up. So all I'm doing here is it's a volume control. It's the camera sensitivity to the available light in this room. And as I'm turning it up, now I'm getting it overexposed because guess what? I haven't changed my aperture. I haven't changed my shutter speed. I've got it fixed as it was. And this will go all the way up to 100. And you can see it's getting really horribly overexposed. If I just come out of that and I will compensate for my silly ISO value. And you can also see that the multimeter reading here, which is basically the thing that Sony camera is using, it's a multimeter. It's showing you what level of exposure you've got. It's gone past the +2, which means it can't show you a high enough value with regards to the exposure that it's got at the moment. So this is clearly flashing. It's saying your +2 stops over. You are overexposed. Do something to get this image looking better. So with the exposure triangle, I've got 3 things to choose from. My shutter speed for video is fixed at 1/50th, and we'll talk about that in a second. So the only thing I can do right now to get this image looking better is to decrease my aperture. So I'm going to make the aperture smaller by making the number bigger. Right, kids?
That's exactly right.
Me. But I'm making the number bigger, reducing the speed, reducing the light. And as you can see, as I'm turning this down, the multimeter is getting to a value. Now that is what Sony thinks is decent exposure for this particular image, because it's a ±0. I mean, the multimeter is a measure of exposure and how your camera is behaving. It shouldn't be the be all and end all. Should be another video talking about histograms and things like that, but we'll leave it at that for now. I don't know whether you can see, but this image is a little bit grainy now compared to what it was before. If I change, let's go back to the right menu. If I change the aperture again, I don't know how far this aperture can go. I think it's 12,800. That image is probably not on my screen, but I think it's going to be quite pixelated, and it's going to have a bit of grain in it. So the higher the ISO value, the more noise I've introduced into the image, because obviously I've turned it up to a silly number. So I'm going to go back and change this now to...
But actually, before you do, Neil, one of the things that we should kind of point out here is, so, and we talked about this, you adjusted the aperture to, by adjusting the aperture, you made the lens iris smaller, which allows less light in. But because you now have f9 as opposed to f1.8, your plane of focus that we spent a bit of time talking about is deeper. And so you can see the speaker it's not totally in focus, but it's more in focus than it was at f1.8.
Exactly.
And so, yeah, like the best way, like you had the triangle, the exposure triangle, the best way to think about this, though, how I've always thought about it and how I teach it, is think about it as like 3 different levers on a pulley. And, you have to, if you adjust one, that will affect the other 2. And the goal is to adjust all 3 to get whatever the condition is that you are going for. So for you, odds are in this particular photo, you probably want the Creator Camp mug to be the point of focus, which means you want to render the background out of focus. So let's open up the aperture. Cool. You open up the aperture. But if you were to open up the aperture right now to f1.8 at ISO 12,800 and a fixed shutter speed of 1/50th, you see what's happening. It's getting overexposed. What can you do? Well, in this case here, you said, and we're going to talk about that, you locked your shutter speed at 1/50th of a second. Your only other variable is ISO. So you go and you either go to your auto ISO or you drop it down until it looks properly exposed. So that's how you have to think about this. Whether you're doing still photography or you're setting up your camera for live streaming or for a video, you have to understand this. Unless you just set your camera to auto everything and the camera will dictate for you.
Yes, but that runs the risk of changing if your environment changes as well. And we've seen that where people's faces will get lighter and darker as the camera is trying to compensate for the available light or the changes in light that are entering your studio. That's why controlling your light is always a good thing as well, which we'll come on to later. But thank you for that valid point there about the focus plane and changing the aperture. And the pulleys is a really good analogy. I'll use that next time.
Sure, absolutely.
Thanks for that. Okay, so the third thing that we are going on to is shutter, and we've spoke about this before. So the shutter speed is effectively the opening and closing of the shutter, and how fast or slow that shutter opens governs, particularly in photography, how frozen or blurry the image will be that you take. Now, for video, and we'll go on to frame rates and things in a second, you typically have a fixed shutter speed. You don't really change that if you are using it in video. I mean, there are circumstances where you do change it. If you're changing your frame rate for things like slow motion, if you wanted a staccato effect, where you're having a very, very high shutter rate, where you can see if there's lots of action you see in action movies, there's almost like a stuttering, there's no motion blur, there's no smoothing of the image. But typically you would always fix your shutter speed with regards to video. But in photography, anything goes. As Brian is fully experienced in, you were saying to me in the pre-show that no two photographs are taken the same with the same settings. You will be changing the aperture, you'll be changing the shutter speed to effectively control the exposure and the stylistic look of the image that you're trying to create. So think of the shutter as opening and closing as it does, and in video, these are set parameters specifically in the environment that you're in, and we'll talk about those frame rates in a second. So where is my shutter control? Well, you'll have guessed it. In fact, I forgot about this image real quick. So just showing the different types of shutter speeds and how it affects the image. On the left-hand side, it's a cat. What a surprise. Or is it? I'm not sure what it is. But on the left-hand side, you've got 1/3000th of a second there as a shutter speed. So a very, very high shutter speed, which means if you take a picture with a very high shutter speed, the action will be frozen in time. There will be no blurring. You are capturing that moment in the blink of an eye. On the right-hand side, we've got a shutter speed of 30 seconds. So for long exposure, for getting those beautiful light trails that you see on motorways, for taking astrophotography and stuff like that, a higher shutter speed is going to introduce more motion blur. You're not going to be able to freeze the image. It's going to be much more blurry compared to a very high shutter speed. And obviously in the middle, 1/60th is typically a shutter speed rate that you would use in video, depending which country you're in and what frame rates that you're selecting. So those are typical things that you would set there. And where you'd find that shutter control is on the left-hand side, where it's always going to be 1 over something. So let's go back to our ZV1, trusty ZV1. Is it ZV1, ZV1? Let's not get into that. No.
It depends on the country you're in.
Exactly. So right now I am at 25 frames a second on my video because I'm in Europe, and we'll talk about why that's important in a second. My shutter speed, therefore, is 1/50. But if I start to change my shutter speed, you can see what's going to happen. So the image is getting darker because the shutter speed is also affecting how much light is coming in to the image. The higher the shutter, the more light you will need in order to get a correct exposure. So as you can see, I'm not changing the light. All I'm doing is winding up the shutter speed. So now I'm at quite a high shutter speed, 1/1000th. You can see the multimeter is flipping out, saying that your image is dark and it's underexposed. So as we spoke about, what can I do? Well, first off, I can't change my aperture to any lower to let any more light in because it's already at the minimum or the maximum, depending which way you look at it. It's already at 1.8. So the only thing I can do now is change my ISO. So I'm going to change my ISO to get it to looking reasonable. I'll probably have to go quite high here because I've really ruined this image by making it 1/1000th. Let's just leave it at that for a second. It's sort of okay-ish. Oh, all right.
There you go. It's exposed. Yeah.
It's exposed. So what's happened now is that we're at 1/100th of a second for our shutter speed. What that means is the focus or the depth of focus is slightly altered again. So the speaker's slightly, oh no, actually it won't be because I'm already at f1.8. So the speaker's going to be the same, sorry. But my ISO is higher than I would expect or would like, which could potentially introduce more noise. And if I move my hand in front, you can see that my hand is quite sharp in terms of when I'm moving. There is no motion blur. It's this staccato effect. So motion blur is introduced by the shutter speed that you set. So the higher the shutter speed, the less motion blur you're going to get. And as I'm moving my hand, you can see it's quite, it has this staccato effect. And this is how your image can be affected with regards to video as well. So that is shutter. I guess, is there anything you wanted to add to that, just to clarify anything else?
There is the complete opposite scenario
Okay.
where imagine if you, and this won't affect people as much in a studio, especially if you can control all of your light sources. But let's say you want to live stream outside, and you happen to be in South Florida, like me, where the sun is absolutely blazing right now, and you want a few things. You want your cake, and you want to eat it too. You want to have a wide open aperture because you love that shallow depth of field. You want yourself in focus, and you want the palm trees behind you out of focus. So, and you also want, in the United States, let's say you are filming for some sort of cinematic video. So you're going to be at 24 frames per second. And we'll talk about this in a second in terms of how to get to the shutter speed, but that will mean that you'll be at 1/50th of a second exposure. So we said you're at f1.8, which means your aperture is wide open, and you are at 1/50th of a second. And your ISO, that means and it's super bright out. So you're like, all right, cool. I'll just drop my ISO to 100. And it's still really, really bright. You're doing everything correct. There comes a point where you now have to implement an accessory, an additional accessory, to further control how much light is coming in. And that's where these things come in. That's why I kind of jumped off really quickly. You would have to use a neutral density filter. So a neutral density filter is the best way that I've ever heard it explained is like sunglasses for your lens. And so if I put this here, this is a piece of glass. This is what's called a 10-stop neutral density filter. We don't have to go into what those stops mean, but effectively, this is almost opaque. If I were to put this in front of my lens, so I'm at 1/50th of a second, I've got f1.8, meaning 1/50th of a second means that my shutter speed is conformed to the frame rate, 24 frames per second. f1.8 means that I'm getting that nice shallow plane of focus, and my ISO is at 100, which means the sensor is least sensitive, minimizing the gain or the noise that would be introduced in your picture. Without this, your picture would be blown out. It would be really overexposed. But if you were to put sunglasses in front of your lens, you are using glass, you're using optics to cut the amount of light coming through. So that's an important, when talking about shutter speed and talking about setting your exposure, especially if you're outside or if you're working with lighting conditions that are too bright, you will need to implement, and this is especially true for video. It's not as big of a deal for still photography, but for video, it is having a neutral density filter, Neil, is critical. So just something to consider.
No, that's a really good point. I forgot to mention that. I mean, it is in my camera bag all the time. I have two neutral density filters. One is a variable one, so it will go between a couple of different stops, which is nice. You can tweak it and turn it around, and it's effectively changing the amount of light coming into the lens. And then another fixed one. Now, if you have some cameras also have built-in ND filters. Some of the higher end cameras have, like the FX something, I think the FX3 or whatever. And even this little silly ZV-1 has an ND filter built in, believe it or not. I'll just show you real quick. So right down here, you can see where at the moment it says ND off. But if I actually flick that switch and turn it on, you'll see the image go darker. And the reason why it's gone darker is it's slapped on, and that's a technical term, by the way, it's slapped on the ND filter. And I love these technical terms. So effectively, that's what, and thank you for bringing that up, the ND filter does. And James has pointed out, who's joined us as well, he basically says, auto everything, blasphemy. It absolutely is blasphemy. If you
He's not wrong.
Auto everything, he's not wrong. No, you see, the good thing about having manual settings on a camera is that you get to learn what affects your image, and it's the best way to learn. A lot of people, when they do buy cameras, especially for live streaming, I get asked this question a lot: what's the best camera for live streaming? Well, There isn't one particular one. But what I do encourage people is if you are to buy a camera, then learn how to use it. Learn the settings. Take some time with the camera. Learn where the controls are and what affects your image, because that's what we're talking about today. And it is relatively straightforward once you get your head around what is affecting the look of my image. And with videography, as Brian said, it's a lot easier. You only have really two things to consider because your shutter speed is pretty much fixed. So all you got to play with is your aperture and your ISO, or play with an ND filter. But anyway, we'll get on to some other bits and pieces in a second. So that is shutter speed. There's not a ton of questions, which is great. Either everybody is fully understanding what we're talking about, or everybody's asleep. But anyway, either way, we'll keep going. It's fun. I'm enjoying myself. So the next thing we're going to be talking about is frame rates. Now, this is a bit of a bone of contention for certain people, especially in the gaming industry. But typically, frame rates are there for a particular reason. And I'm not going to go into the historical ramifications of why film is deemed to be 24 frames per second. That's just the way it is. It's really how our eye perceives the world. And it's deemed to be that 24 frames per second is really the look of what we see day to day. And that's why in film, 24 frames per second was deemed to be the best representation of real life. And it's still around today, and everybody who professes to be cinematic and wanting to get a cinematic image always films in 24. Now, what you're seeing right now on my side, I'm actually, all my cameras, even though I'm in Europe, is set to 24 frames per second. But one interesting point for all you YouTube streamers out there, YouTube does not conform to 24 frames per second for Europe. So even though I'm sending this image out to YouTube as a live stream at 24 frames per second, if you looked at the stats for nerds in your YouTube stream right now, you would see that this is actually being broadcast at 30 frames per second. And that's basically it. So YouTube does not go any lower than 30 frames per second for when you're live streaming. But when you're posting a video, it will conform to whatever your video has been configured to. So just as an FYI there, because I got caught out with that, thinking, why is my video not at 24 frames per second when I'm sending it? But anyway, that's YouTube for you. Anyway, back to this. So frame rates really in your camera is specifically around the video side of things. And there's 24 frames per second, which is film, 25 if you're in Europe. And the reason why it's 25 frames in Europe compared to 30 frames, for example, in the US, is it's all to do with the frequency of the mains electricity. So in Europe and in the UK, your mains electricity is running at 50 hertz, 50 cycles per second. And in the US, it's 60 cycles per second. So why should we care about that? Well, to avoid things like flicker and light flicker that you will see when you're moving into these different countries or having your camera set incorrectly, you should be setting your frame rates to half of what the frequency is of your country specifically. And we'll go on to how that sort of is set up in a second. But there's a number of different frame rates that you can set your camera to, 24, 30, or 60. The gamers, streamers do love 60 frames per second. And then if you're in Europe, 25, 50, and obviously 120 for that super slow motion. So what does that mean with regards to your camera? We'll go on to how that's set up in your camera in a second, and it's all to do with how you configure your camera specifically for what country you're in and also what frame rates. Some cameras will allow you to do multiple different types of frame rates. But in terms of settings, what you should be looking at doing is basically using this table or something similar. So if you have a frame rate of 24 frames per second, most cameras don't do 1/48, which would be double. So when you are setting your frame rate, you should always be setting your shutter speed to be double that of the frame rate. And that gives you the most natural, pleasing motion blur and things like that. 24 frames per second is used for film, cinematic, and it's in the USA region, of course, typically. 25 frames per second is what I use sometimes. Again, your shutter speed would be 1/50 because that's double. And then the rest is the same. 30 frames per second, you'd set it to 1/60. And then 60 frames a second, it would be 1/20. So when you are considering what frame rate to use for your camera, you should also honor and look at setting the correct shutter speed in order to get the most natural looking motion blur and the right settings for your camera to avoid flicker and things like that. I'm not sure if there's anything else you wanted to add to that before we go on to sort of setting other things up, Brian.
No, I mean, it's you kind of hit the nail on the head. You first need to ask yourself the intent.
Right.
What are you trying to do? And then set what you're trying to do dictates your frame rate. Your frame rate dictates your shutter speed. Those are, once you have that locked in, then you have, like we talked about, aperture and ISO to fiddle around with, as well as lights. And I mean, we can really go deep into this in terms of like ensuring that, you know, the frame rate of your clips conforms to the project that you're working on if you're editing video. But I think that's a whole
video.
separate.
Yeah,
that's for another
if you do
video.
Slow
Yeah.
motion and things like that. Yeah, because
Correct.
it's an artistic, stylistic look as well. I mean, people may want to shoot at a very high frame rate and slow it down later in post. People might like the higher frame rate look anyway, just for the video. And I've seen a lot of YouTube streaming channels, and it's particularly around the gamers who like to stream at 60 frames per second because, one, it's a very, very smooth look. As I've mentioned here, think of news shows, QVC, gaming, soap operas, you know, that very, very smooth, buttery smooth type look that you would get. It almost looks like VHS video or Betamax back in the day, if anybody remembers that. So that is it's a choice. When you're live streaming though, a 60 frame per second live stream is going to use and consume a lot more bandwidth from a data rate perspective than a 24 or 25 frames per second. So obviously you need to consider that as well. I see a lot of people sometimes talk about, well, my video is stuttering. It doesn't look very good because you're filming at 60 frames per second. Anyway, it uses a lot more bandwidth. So just keep in mind, as Brian said, what frame rate to use, what you should be selecting. And if I just go into the ZV-1 real quick, if I can find the menu item, if I go to this menu here, let me find the right menu item. Okay, so in my settings, it's a bit weird on here because I've had to do this for the HDMI thing, but you can basically change the recording settings on here. So you can see we've got 30p, which is 30 frames a second, 24, 120, 60, and so on. At the moment, I've just set it to 30 just so I can get this HDMI output to work. But again, when you set up your camera, think about the frame rate, think about the environment that you're in. And typically you would set your camera to be either NTSC or PAL. NTSC is the North American standard, so everything will be based around 60 hertz. So 30 frames a second, 120, 60. And then the other one is PAL, which is the European standard. That's more 25, 50, and so on. So those are some of the things around frame rates. But frame rates really is not going to affect your exposure to an extent. In terms of how you set it, the controls of that is still based around the ISO, shutter speed, and your aperture. So some of the things that we've mentioned before about flicker. We've seen some issues where people have set up their studios, set up their live stream, and then they're seeing something called banding or the lights are flickering. So there's various reasons for that. First off, it could be that your shutter speed isn't actually set to the right frequency of your household mains. So as we mentioned before, here in Europe, it's 50 hertz. So 1/24 or 1/25 or even 1/50 would be fine. But if you start to deviate and change those shutter speeds, then you may be seeing some flicker in the lights. I've got some overhead LED lights that are just here to light this little studio when I'm not using the main lights. And they will have this weird sort of flickering banding, and it looks really annoying. And unfortunately, there's only a couple of things that you can do with that. You can adjust or have something called variable shutter configured in your camera, which will incrementally change your shutter speed by 0.1, 0.2, and so on. Instead of changing it in large increments, it will change it in smaller increments. That means you can dial in and try and reduce some of this flicker. So those are some of the things that you can change. One of the main things that I would recommend, and Brian recommends the same, is just get dedicated lights for your video setup. I think Brian may have a prop that he's going to show us
I have the
Right there.
box. Yeah, I got these. These are, I'm trying, it's, you see, it's being blown out. So there, let's kind of tilt it so you can see. I got these for Black Friday last year. These are aperture, uh, it's not aperture like lens aperture, it's aperture, APURTUR.
It's the
Anyway,
wrong spelling of aperture, isn't it?
it is,
Exactly.
yeah, aperture. And actually, I see Martin was bringing up about, it's talking about lights, so it's
Lights,
perfect
yeah.
timing. Yeah.
Perfect timing. Thanks, Martin.
Yeah.
Hello, Keith.
What when you go to buy video lights, what you'll want to make sure of is that the lights they will not flicker across a wide variety of shutter speeds, and especially if you buy lights made by companies that already produce video lights. So Aperture makes some very popular like constant lights, like these large lights that will output at certain color temperatures. And Aperture is a very, like I said, very popular one. They have a kind of a lower tier called Amaran. That I use Amaran lights. They're fantastic. But the point is that you want to make sure that the lights you're using are rated for video. And you and I were discussing this, Neil, a couple of days ago, where I have on this bookshelf over here. Oh man, yeah. Let's see this book. Oh, Neil, I have crashing and there we go. Perfect. This bookshelf here. It is so hard to orient yourself.
I know.
But there's a Philips Hue light strip, and I learned the hard way that Philips Hue light strips do not play well on video. You would see what Neil was talking about when the light turns on. There is this like banding that goes up and down, and it's very distracting. And not to be too harsh, but it immediately kind of gives a sense of, I hate to say it, but it's kind of like an amateur look.
Yeah.
Like if you're putting the money in to get a dedicated camera and lens and all the production stuff, the last thing you want is to kind of kneecap yourself by using lights that end up being a distraction for your viewer more than anything else. Yes, it will illuminate the wall, but you're going to see this like weird banding where the light goes up and down. It's very mesmerizing to a degree. But the point is that for me right now, I use for my primary, my key light, my primary light, my fill light are just a pair of Elgato key lights. When I switch offices, hopefully in a few days, I'm going to use one of those Amaran 60D lights with a mini light dome. So it's like a diffuser that will wrap light around me really softly. And then I'll use one of these key lights as a fill. So watch, if I were to turn off the right light here, do you see how, or I can make it really bright. You see how the right side of me is getting really bright. But when I do that, or actually, let me turn it off. What happens is it's kind of tough because I have sunlight coming in, but one side of my face is brighter than the other. So you use a main light to light one part of you, and then you can use a fill light. So here, this other side fills the other side of me, if that's what you want to go for. Point is, these lights are, Elgato is a very, very popular company for streamers and for gamers. Right. Their lights will not flicker. As you can see, the lights are on. They're not flickering. I can also change the temperature if I want it like really warm light.
Warm it up.
Yeah, like I can make really warm light like that, or I can make the light cooler. Point is that it's really important that when you are investing in the lights for your streaming studio, that you confirm that, well, even these bulbs, like if you need light, this is just a regular traditional light bulb, but it covers the full RGB color spectrum, but these will not flicker. And it's also cool because they have a battery, so I can literally just hold the light bulb on and, have my effects. And that's another thing. That's another video, but like talking about practical lights and kind of effect lights and stuff like that. But
No problem. We have a
yeah,
question actually, just on this
sure.
subject. Let me see if I can get this comment to come in the right place. And it's a gamble. There it is. It sort of came in. Let me just move it to the right place. Sorry. So this is Daryl, otherwise known as AKA Video Like a Dad. It's a great channel. Why is that? Dear oh dear, come on. Let's squash this up and put it in the right place. Okay, that's
There we
good.
go.
So he's basically saying his cheap LED soft lights causes banding at reduced intensity, and his Sony A6400 didn't help, even though he'd set it up. He set up the light intensity and fully compensate with ND filter. So no, so changing your light intensity and compensating with an ND isn't going to reduce the banding. The banding is caused by a mismatch between the shutter speed of your camera and the frequency of what the lights are actually running at. And as Brian said, cheaper lights, unfortunately, aren't very regular. They may say that they're running in mains electricity at 60 hertz, but they might be running at 55.6 hertz, something like that. That's why they're having a mismatch. So on the Sony A6400, I think you can still adopt this setting that I pointed out here, where you can go into the menu setting and change the anti-flicker set, or something called variable shutter. I think the A6400 has that. So Daryl, it might be worth you looking at your manual in your camera to see if there's something called anti-flicker. And all that does, I can't show you on here, but effectively what it will do is, where you see on your shutter speed, where I'm going up by 1/60, 1/80, it's going to go to something like 50.01, 02, 03. It's going to incrementally change that shutter speed in very small increments. And it's just going to be a little bit of trial and error. You're going to be tweaking the shutter speed in these small increments and watching the lights to see if the banding stops. And it will when you get the frequency of your shutter speed to match the frequency of what your lights is actually working at. And hopefully that answers your question. All right, he said he will confirm. Let us know, because that could be an option. And I don't have an A6400. I do have some Sony cameras. If I bought any more, I'd be in trouble. So let's not do that. But anyway, so back to the presentation. So that's obviously some of the things that you can change. And as Brian quite rightly pointed out, then the correct shutter speed for the environment is vital. So make sure you've got, the right setting in terms of your electricity and the right environment. But please, if you can, buy dedicated lights, because they will cost a bit more. Dedicated video lights cost a bit more. And I was the same as you, Brian. I had a Hue light strip. It was annoying. And I also you can also buy one of those Hue sort of bars, right? Those sort of, I think they have those as well. And they're great for, dinner time and sitting in your home, comfortable environment watching TV. But if you're starting to be serious about video recording and having a nice live stream and having a nice studio setup, then you should be really looking at getting decent lights. Now I've got similar to you, so I've got here the Elgato key light, which I've just turned off, which is just one of the lights, and then I've got a Godox GL60 light, which is this one here, which is my main key light. So again, it's just a simple 2-point lighting setup, 2 lights here and here, and then behind me I've got 2 Godox RGB strip lights. They are the TL60s. 60s is for the inches, so I think it's 60 inches per light, and they don't flicker, they don't do anything, and they're rock solid. So investing in lighting can really, change the look of your image. You can have the best camera, the best lens in the world, but if your lighting is off, and if you just use standard overhead lights, then it's not going to give you a good look. And, depending what you do. And I'm looking forward, Brian, to seeing your new studio. I'm sure it's going to look
I am
different.
too.
Yeah, once you get in there and stuff. Great. All right, so that was avoiding flicker. Brian did touch on color temperature and white balance. Now, color temperature, or the temperature of color within cameras, is measured in something called kelvins, which is the unit of measurement that it uses. And you'll see this in your camera settings you've got numbers that you can change your color temperature to, or you've got little symbols that represent the environment that you're shooting in. So for example, you've got a cloud for a cloudy environment, you've got sunshine for a sunny environment, and so on. So these settings that you get with your camera are set to mimic the color temperature of what that particular light is at the time. So setting something to daylight, for example, in this particular case, I don't know why I'm moving my mouse, that's not going to show anybody. So moving it for sort of daylight or being at noon or midday, respectfully is around 5,500 kelvins. That's the sort of temperature. And you'll see that the lights that we're using in our studio are set or fixed in this particular case to 5,500 Kelvin. The Elgato light is variable, as Brian's just demonstrated, that you can change it to a warmer tone. So winding it down to around this area will make it a little bit warmer. I'll bring it up to a higher value, makes it look more blue, makes it look more cold. So depending on the look that you're going for, there's no right and wrong settings for your studio environment. But if you're out and about and you're trying to get the respective color in line with what your environment is and how your camera should be set, then you should be taking note of, well, is it cloudy? Is it bright daylight? And therefore you should be setting your camera to the respective settings that you see in that. Now, most cameras as well have the ability to dial in a particular numeric value, so you can change the value of your white balance or your color temperature for your camera to match exactly with a specific number. But what we're going to talk about now is actually setting your white balance for your studio environment. Now, if you don't actually know what color temperature your lights are, then you could get yourself something called a gray card, a handy dandy gray card. Now, Brian's got about 8 of these in his studio, knocking around.
Yeah.
Well, you've shown me 2 already. I'm actually curious of how many you've actually got, but I'm convinced there's more than one.
I have 2 of these. One of them is, so this is a product called a Color Checker Passport formerly it was called X-Rite Photo, but they changed their names to, I think, Color Bright, a play off of Calibrate, I think. But
Right.
Point is, so this is more for, on one side of this, you have these various color swatches. And so you can, this is especially helpful when you're editing your photos. If you really need to ensure color fidelity, you've got all of these different color swatches. You also have various, these kind of gray chips over here. But what we're talking about more practically for the purposes of this video is you have this is a neutral gray card. Now, because of the exposure in my office, it looks brighter than it is because I like to kind of make my picture a little bit brighter. But the point is that what you can do is you can either use this card right here, or I also have a much larger one primarily for video people. But you can see on one side here, there's some similar color chips, but on the other side is this neutral gray. And what you would do is you can use this thing to get a custom white balance based on your studio, the conditions of your studio. And so, we can talk about that as well. But I guess I would say, Neil, that I would really only recommend using one of these things. If you're using one of these things, that means that you want to get what we call a custom white balance.
Yep.
You should really only do that if you can really control the lighting conditions of your office perpetually.
Yes. I mean, to your point, lots of people have a studio set up in their home. Their home has windows, and windows lets in light. Now, if you can't block, to your point, that's why you're moving, right? So
That's right.
To have a controlled environment. Now, in my room, I'm in an attic space above my house, which has no windows. And I like that because I'm a bit of a mushroom, so I like having no light. But I also have the ability to control my light 100% with everything I've got. If I turned all my lights off, you wouldn't see anything. So in that environment, it's easier for me to set a custom white balance to get exactly so the camera effectively knows exactly what color temperature to set itself to based on the light that I have. Now, if you set your white balance to auto, that's fine. But 2 things. one, the auto white balance that the camera thinks your environment is set to isn't always going to match effectively. Even if you have control lighting, the auto white balance is a factory preset that's configured in the camera. And there will be tolerances between cameras and obviously the available light. Now, by all means, you can set it to auto white balance, see what that looks like. But as Brian mentioned, he's in an office with a window. And as soon as the light changes, get a cloudy environment, you're going to get a color shift of some kind. The camera is then going to say, hang on a minute, the temperature has changed. I'm on auto white balance. I'm now going to change my color temperature ever so slightly to compensate for the changes in light. And you'll get that color shift and you'll get some sort of drifting, and it is going to be noticeable to your audience. So my advice would be to, if possible, one, control the lighting in your environment by either drawing curtains, whatever it is, to block out the natural light. Or if you know it's going to be a cloudy day for the time that you're filming, by all means, set it up like that. But setting a custom white balance isn't as scary or as difficult as you would expect. I'm going to try and show you how to do it now live, which is always fun.
Nice.
So I've got a gray card here. And at the moment, let's have a look. What's our exposure set to? Okay, so it's not terrible. So I'm going to go into my menu, function menu settings here, and you'll see that there's something called auto white balance on my camera. I'm going to flick out of that. And here, as I mentioned, are all the different settings. So on the left-hand side, you've got daylight, whatever that is. Oh, shade. Yeah,
Shade.
I can never remember. And then you've got cloudy. And as you can see, as I'm flicking through these different presets, my color temperature is changing. Now that's completely blue because it's thinking I've got an incandescent light, and incandescent lights have a different color temperature than obviously the lights that I'm using right now. And then you've got some fluorescent lights and so on. So we could go on down the list, but I'm going to go to auto white balance fish. That's interesting. No, it's underwater. I didn't even know it had that. How fun. Auto white balance fish, classic. Okay, so now you can see that we're getting onto the numeric values. So this is where you can set the camera with a numeric value. So I'm changing the Kelvin value with respect to what I think my lights are. I think mine are actually something like 5,500 they're supposed to be set to. But anyway, I'll come back out of that. What we want to do is set a custom white balance. And you can do that by going on to these different menus. Now, every camera is slightly different. My Sony a7 IV will only let me set a custom white balance if I'm in completely manual mode and not one of the custom presets. Oh, there goes my cup. Oh,
there goes your prop.
Prop is gone. Sorry about that. Stay there. Sorry, shouldn't be.
How did that even happen?
I don't know. It's just balanced. It's balanced on a candle holder down at the bottom. Don't ask. It's an old candle. I had to prop it up some way to get it there. Never work with props, children or animals alive, people.
Oh, man.
There you go.
The brilliance of live streaming. I love it.
Anyway, so some cameras will not allow you to set this easily. So read the manual, work out how to set your white balance. But this is pretty easy. So I'm going on to a custom white balance setting. We've got 3 in the Sony ZV-1. I'm going to move it to the right. And basically it's saying, now you can set this. So how to set this is, it'll tell you on the instructions. I'm going to move it to the right. Nope, that's the wrong one. Let me go back, sorry. I have to go and set it to, I think it's one of these. Because everyone's slightly different. So if I set that, okay.
There you go.
So it's coming up with a square in the middle. And this square is asking for me to put a gray card or white card. Gray is the best color for this because this is how some of the cameras are calibrated. And it's sometimes called 18% gray or mid-gray. This is basically what you should be using for skin tone. So this gray card, I'm just going to put this in front of the camera. Now, what you should do is have it completely covering the lens, and then you simply hit the center button to take a capture. And that's going to measure the available light within your environment and give you the correct color temperature for this. So I'll click on this. And as you can see, it's set it to 6100 Kelvin. This is what it thinks the right white balance is for my particular environment. So I'm not going to be the one that disagrees with it. So I'm just going to hit the middle button and enter. And that basically now should mean that my color temperature for the environment I've got right now, and that's the ambient light that the camera's seeing. If I was to maybe move my camera back and have it in a different environment, that color temperature may shift. So always recalibrate if you move your camera around. That's typically what I would do anyway. Okay,
that's right.
So we basically said that use a gray card, set up your camera for spot metering. Spot metering is whereby the camera is going to take a small portion of the image as where it's measuring the light from. Some cameras, you can set it to measure the light of the entire image. Sometimes you can set it, in this particular case, I've got a very small square here, and this is the focus point, but also this would potentially be your capture point for where the camera is measuring the light coming into it. So, and you can set that up, I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but you can set this up on your menu as well, whereby, actually it's not in this menu, I won't bother, because it means I have to hunt around the menu system. But there are multiple settings within the camera in order for you to set that. I can't remember where it is, but I'm not going to go.
It's under a metering setting, but yeah.
It's somewhere in there, exactly.
Yep.
So that's one thing that you should be looking at as well. So setting it to spot metering means that it will take the measurement in a particular concentrated part of the image, and that's great specifically if you are using this gray card. So set your white balance to the white balance of your studio and have control over your lighting as we mentioned. Let's see. So that's where the auto white balance would be setting on the camera. And as you can see here on mine, if I pull up this menu, because there's a ton of different menus on the Sony. One more. You'll see now that the white balance has been set to the respective color temperature that I've set with my custom white balance. So that's where you would see it on this particular camera. So hopefully we've explained the exposure triangle in detail. There's a ton of stuff that goes into getting a good image in your camera, but that's just a sort of an overview on that for the exposure triangle. So there's just some sort of closing points, some other considerations, things to think about, especially for live streaming and video work, especially if you're having this set up in your studio. So I think Brian wanted to just mention a couple of things. So just talk to us, Brian, a little bit about the iPhone portrait mode and how wonderful it was when it came out, but obviously there's a few caveats with regards to that.
Yeah, I mean, the iPhone is a totally capable camera if you want to use it for live streaming. Like, it's in a pinch, it's great. And with each new generation, they get better. But here's the thing. You cannot avoid the laws of physics when it comes to optics. You cannot avoid what's required for a picture to be resolved, meaning light has to travel through some sort of a lens, and it has to be resolved onto a sensor. So we've talked about how a lot of times we want that really nice shallow plane of focus, right? Like, we want us to be in focus and we want our background to kind of fall out of focus. Apple, they actually implemented a pretty ingenious tool, and every other mobile phone manufacturer has done the same thing, but you probably have seen it. It's called portrait mode. And portrait mode it skirts the laws of physics by implementing what we call computational photography. So it's using hardware and software to simulate what you would do with a traditional camera and lens. So when you turn on portrait mode, you've seen this. You will become sharp, and then it will. I don't know. I don't want to get too far into the weeds, but basically, the iPhone will try to determine how far the background is behind you, and it creates what's called a depth map. And so when it knows where you are, it blurs everything behind you, and that's fine. That works well for a still photo, when just a quick picture. But the problem when you use that for live streaming or video is, as you're moving forward, backwards, so left to right, the iPhone or your mobile camera has to constantly redraw that depth map. And so you've seen this. I'm sure all of you have seen this, where someone's moving around and they have this weird effect around them.
It's like
sometimes it's like, yeah, it's like or all of a sudden behind them will be sharp because the depth map hasn't drawn that part in.
Right.
And so, to illustrate it, I mean, here's an iPhone. I mean, that's an iPhone. That's the lens is right here, and the sensor is millimeters behind it. And we'll talk about sensor size in a second. But if you were to take, say, a lens, this is a zoom lens. I mean, this is just the lens. This is just the optic, and you can see how as I zoom it out, there are glass elements here throughout the lens, and then you have that amount of distance from the front of the lens to the back of the lens to the camera. When we're talking about iPhone considerations and why you might want to consider investing in a proper camera and a lens, of course, if your budget and your needs allow for it, you stand to benefit because you'll get the purest, cleanest picture and effect optically. What I mean by optically is you're using optics, you're using light and glass to resolve the picture, as opposed to computational photography, which is using software and AI, which is getting better and better to simulate it. So that's just one of the things, Neil. Like I certainly don't want to make anyone feel like, oh, I only have an iPhone. Like, of course, I'd rather you stream with an iPhone than not stream at all. But it's important to understand what you will stand to gain by moving to optics, to proper optics.
Yeah, I mean, there's been many videos when this first came out with the portrait mode, and you were seeing, can you tell the difference between an iPhone and a $10,000 Sony camera?
Right.
Yes, you can. But the point is, I mean, and it does serve a purpose, and it gives people the opportunity to experience what a bokeh, is it bokeh? Bokeh would be like if they had a decent sort of lens and camera setup. So there's no harm in it, but just be aware of what it may look like if you're starting to move, as Brian's pointed out, particularly using an iPhone camera in portrait mode for video. And you are going to get some of this wavy mushing going on. And it's fine if you're on a Zoom call, but if you're trying to level up your live streaming and look more professional, then you may want to consider investing in a relatively cheap camera. I mean, if you look at how much a sort of half decent Sony ZV-E 10 is now, or 1 or something, I can't remember which one it is.
Both. Yeah.
You can get a decent image out of any of those cameras, and they'll be far better than what you will see on your iPhone camera, just because it's dedicated for that particular purpose. And an iPhone is fantastic if you've got only that camera and you're in a pinch. But yeah,
right.
Absolutely. So that brings us on to sensors and lenses. You were talking a little bit about sort of optics, specifically around the glass and the sensor sizes. So that's worth just pointing out the difference between full frame and APS-C lenses.
Yes. So if you are researching what kind of camera to buy, we're talking about a dedicated camera, you're probably going to come across two terms. One is going to be full frame. One is going to be called probably APS-C or cropped sensor, like Neil just said, APS-C. What we're talking about is the actual size of the sensor in your camera. Even the iPhone has a sensor, and it's really, I can't show it to you because it's sealed in the iPhone chassis, but this is a Sony a6300. This is Sony's APS-C, wait, what? Did I say APS-C 6300 or A6300?
No, you did say A6300, but then you said APS-C after, so you were fine.
Yeah, my wires got crossed. But yeah, this is Sony's 6000 line is their cropped sensor. So if I take the sensor cap off, or the body cap, you'll see there is the sensor right there. It's about the size of a postage stamp. And the sensor size, the reason why it's so important is because the larger the sensor, the more light can hit it, and the higher the resolution, the larger your picture. And generally, I'm not going to say that sensor size directly correlates to the quality of your image, but it definitely does help. If we were to, by comparison, look at the Sony A7, this is the Sony A7R Mark V. This is my workhorse. This is my primary camera. It's like a 60 megapixel camera. It has a full frame sensor. So, I mean, you can see here, I'll compare the two in a second, but you can see that it's a much larger sensor. So let me take the A6300. Let's see if I can do some acrobatics here. And here. So,
yeah, we can see that.
You can see that, the sensor on the A7 on the top is much larger. Let me move my finger. Than the A6300. And so what you're looking at here is a full frame sensor versus a cropped sensor. There are implications to depending on the size of your sensor, different things. We don't have to go into that now. But point is that sensor size is one of those things when you start hunting for a new camera that you will kind of have to figure out. And the larger, just think that the larger the sensor, if the sensor is a bucket, think of it as a bucket, and what the bucket collects is light. A full frame sensor is a larger bucket, meaning it can capture more light. A crop sensor is a smaller bucket, can capture less light. And then your iPhone is a little thimble, and it can capture we will not, we can really geek out over this, but I don't want to make people's eyes glaze over any more than I already have. Just know that sensor size is really, it's not something you have to spend too much time on, but it is a factor that you're going to consider when you're investing in a camera.
Definitely. Yeah. And we're coming up to our time. So we've got a couple of more points really to just point out. Sure. So we wanted just to talk about composition, rule of thirds, and leading lines. And Brian's studio is designed to give you a warm and fuzzy feeling when you're looking in. And the reason why that is you're going to explain it right now in terms of your leading lines, and your intentional placement of items and your camera placement does have an effect on how the image is perceived and how your image looks, specifically when we're doing live streams like we are right now.
That's correct. So first, I put my desk when I'm working on my camera, on my computer. I am perpendicular to my desk, so this is where my computer is. But I positioned my primary camera at this angle for a few reasons. First, it creates leading lines. So what I mean by that, you see this bookshelf right here? No, this right there. That bookshelf, oh man, I will never get that on the first shot ever. We even tried this before we went live. But if you look at it in the picture, it kind of looks like the shelves are almost at an angle. That has to do with perspective. Obviously, these shelves are perfectly straight. They're parallel to each other. But notice how the way those lines are almost pointing towards me. They're drawing the eye towards the center of the frame. Same thing when I positioned this corner of the room. I positioned it more on what would be the camera left. Is this your?
Like camera left, you're right. Yeah.
Yeah. So more, I biased it there because it also creates kind of a pleasing division in the wall. And then even when I'm sitting, so if I'm going to be doing a video on YouTube where I'm introing my video and I'm on this camera, even the way I position my photo in the, there we go, where my head is in between the frame, it kind of nestles in there and the frame kind of surrounds my head. The picture is darker than my head, than my skin. And so it creates a really nice separation. One of the, so we're talking about leading lines. We're talking about rule of thirds. These are very, very basic compositional tips, whether you're doing photo or video. Another quick thing, if you can avoid, is you want to avoid having a hard line bisect or intersect your head. So you see how now when I'm sitting like this, the picture frame is jutting out from the top of my head. Yeah. That's not visually pleasing. So when you're thinking about how you arrange your studio, Yeah, people go down that rabbit hole. Like, we talked about camera settings, we talked about lights, but that's a whole nother stream for sure, is how to compose your practical effects.
Yeah, I like that. We should definitely do a stream on just getting the studio environment set up, because I mean, you've commented before on how mine is set, and some of it was intentional in terms of sort of some of these leading lines, and I do use sometimes a grid to help me. It's not set up correctly now; it should be a bit lower, but just to give me an idea about where the composition is. And obviously, I'm sort of slap bang in the center of this, but I've got leading lines from the piano behind me here, and then this area here is all pointing towards the sort of the center of the image. So that's hopefully drawing people into the focus. At the end of the day, if you're a talking head live streamer, you want the focus to be on you. You don't want it to have any distractions. That's why I don't like my background to be too cluttered as well. I try to be, a bit more minimalist, and it's a personal choice. Some people love to have books and all kinds of stuff in there, but it's a consideration about, and it's a consideration. I mean, yours looks really good as well, but it's just different, right? And that's the thing. They're just different sort of studio environments. And I'm just wondering how long it's going to take you to set up your new studio with all these considerations that you're thinking about now. Actually, it could be months. Man, it could be months.
I wish I had it. It's outside, but my wife and I, we cut out of pieces of paper each one of these things, we to scale. So everything was cut.
Oh, are you serious? Oh, wow. So you know exactly what that's. Oh dear.
I wish it's right outside in the living room, but that's how fantastic. Seriously we take it. Yeah.
But it's important, right? I mean, if this is your profession, and if you want to look good on camera, and you need to show up and look like you're a professional who deserves the rates and the work that you're charging for it, and not turn up in a bedroom like a lot of people do, unfortunately, and things like that, and have clutter. I've conducted many interviews with people, and I'm thinking, if you could have just moved that out of the way, it would have looked a lot better.
Yes.
And it's about consideration of what you've got behind there. We did want to talk a little bit about manual focus and full range autofocus. Maybe we want to save that for another day, in terms, sure. unless you can do something real quick on that. I'm just conscious of time, because we've been going for an hour and a half, which is great, and I'm loving the content, but I don't think we've got anything else to talk about after this. But maybe you just wanted to touch on it real quick in terms of,
sure.
Is it a quick topic, I guess?
Yeah, it is. We kind of touched it. I think I covered it in the beginning, but basically your lens can be in one of two states. It can either be in autofocus, so it's constantly attempting to lock on to what it thinks should be the focus point, or you can have it in manual focus, meaning you adjust the focus and it stays there. It does not move. This is a consideration for live streamers, because if you have your lens set to manual focus, if you kind of move in and out, depending on your aperture, depending on how deep your plane of focus is, you'll be out of focus if you move back and forth. The other thing is, let's say you want to use a prop. If I was in manual focus, the camera would never update. Like, I would constantly be sharp and this would be out of focus. But because I have my camera set to autofocus and it's always focusing in the center of the frame, I know to put whatever I want in focus right here in the center. And then when I move it, it'll snap to me. So that's just something to consider. There are very few reasons in live streaming to be in manual focus. So I would just keep it at autofocus.
Yeah, and we did touch on it before, you're right. And some cameras are better than others with autofocus. Yes. The older cameras aren't anywhere near as good as the newer ones. I mean, nowadays I think with the camera you've got, there's even AI-based autofocus on there as well. Correct. It's going to detect whether you're an animal, whether you're a human or not. So the autofocus has got so much better now. There's absolutely no reason not to have autofocus on. And as long as you don't, and we can go into this another time, but there are multiple settings with the autofocus, how sensitive it is to changes in focus, how quickly it's going to lock on and stay locked onto you as opposed to shifting and drifting. And you don't want to have any of this hunting that you would see in the background as the focus is trying to hunt and find you. And that's been a problem with some autofocuses in the past of other cameras that we've mentioned before. But we're not going to slate any camera manufacturer here. We love all cameras as long as they work effectively.
That's right.
But we've actually come to the end of the presentation, which is great. And really, I just can't thank you enough for being on the show today and helping me with this. I mean, these aren't the easiest of topics, and there is a lot to consider, especially when people are just new to cameras and things. But hopefully this presentation, this live stream has gone some way into at least demystifying, for want of a better term, some of the camera terms that we've spoke about. And if this live stream wasn't enough, you may be seeing more of Brian and I in the near future as we embark on a Tuesday night chill and chat about gear and cameras and things like that. The first of that show will be a little bit later than advertised at 10:30 UK next Tuesday, I think. With the time difference, it's really still confusing me with this 4-hour time difference. Well, we'll set up a little schedule and make sure you are. It'll be on this channel, of course, and Brian has kindly agreed to join me from time to time on live streams on a regular setup just to chill out. And we've got a lot more things to talk about in terms of camera setup, gear, and things like that, especially with regards to sort of video and photography production, because, you know, I'm a keen photographer as well. Don't do it as much as I should, but obviously we can learn lots from the master here when it comes to doing photography. Well, you know, what can I say? But
I
anyway,
appreciate it.
Once again, thank you so much. And if you want to get hold of Brian, you can just get him on the socials at Brian Matias. If I'm getting your name right there, hopefully that's how it's said. And
Perfect.
Join me next Thursday for another live stream. I don't know what it's going to be about yet. It might be about more camera stuff. You never know. And Brian and I will be around next Tuesday on this channel. So if you want to come and see us, please do so. Brian, thanks again for your time. I'll have a chat to you just after the stream has ended. But for now, thanks a lot, and see you all next time.